Hello, my name is Joe Foy, and I'm Protected Areas Campaigner for the Wilderness Committee. We're a Canadian environmental organization. The Wilderness Committee has been working to protect spotted owls and their habitat in Canada for about 30 years, which is coincidentally about as long as we've owned that tea kettle over there. During this whole time that we've been working to protect spotted owls and their habitat, the provincial government has continued to hand out logging permits. And we've continued to push the federal government into enacting an endangered species law, which they did in the early 2000s. And then we continued to push them to actually enforce it, which is what this video is about. I promise to keep you updated on what's happening with the protection of spotted owl habitat, primarily old forests in the lower mainland of British Columbia, and I have new news, and that's what I want to talk about. So I'm going to have a quick little talk about definitions of the words that I use. The lower mainland is the southwest mainland portion of British Columbia, and it sort of has elastic boundaries. When people say lower mainland, they may mean different things. They might mean just the urban area, but usually lower mainland is a larger area, and when I use the term lower mainland, I'm actually using quite a large area. I'm saying from Lillooet down to the U.S. border and from Manning Park to the shores of Howe Sound. And for those of you that live here, you know where those places are. That is the range of spotted owls. This is the area where spotted owls have lived in the past, and this is the continuing range today. Now, there's a number of jurisdictions I'll be speaking about, and it relates to the land. The federal jurisdiction, the federal government is responsible for the Species at Risk Law, Canada's Endangered Species Law. So that's the law we got in the early 2000s that the Wilderness Committee were working to see enforced so that species don't go extinct. It's pretty simple. And the main thing that most species, virtually all species, need is their habitat. So depending on how much their habitat is being protected or being impacted by human activities, that determines what sort of health the species is in. And spotted owl numbers have been super declining because of continued logging. Now, the province has jurisdiction here too. The way Canada is set up, the provinces run the resources, mining, logging, that sort of thing. So though the federal government, its responsibility is to enact and enforce the Species at Risk Law, the province's jurisdiction has been to hand out logging permits because they're in charge of that part of our world, and that's where the clash has happened. Now, there's a third jurisdiction that plays into this whole discussion. That's First Nations. All of spotted owl habitat is on unceded First Nations territory, and that's where we get into British Columbia language. If you're from British Columbia, you've probably heard that term before, unceded. It means that these are lands that have never been given up. They've never been sold. They've never been lost in war. And that's why continuing court cases and negotiations seek to formalize First Nations land back aspirations. In other words, these are territories, all of them, all of the area we're talking about are territories that continue to be owned, to be unceded, ungiven away, unlost territories of First Nations. And in the case of the spotted owls, all spotted owl habitat in British Columbia, in Canada, all spotted owl habitat is within the territories of Salish speaking nations, both coastal Salish and interior Salish. Nations like Squamish or Musqueam in the interior spotted owl habitat is in the Kapnuk territory and also in Statlium territory. So as we get into this conversation and I say we, oftentimes I'm meaning the people that live here, because there are all these different jurisdictions, different entities, and all of these have decision-making authorities when it comes to protecting this highly endangered species and played pivotal roles. It's pivotal what British Columbia will choose to do in stopping to hand out logging permits in spotted owl habitat. It's pivotal in how the federal government acts in finally enforcing its species at risk law, and First Nations have taken a leadership role. In more recent times, the Spuzum First Nation has taken a huge leadership role in supporting the release of captive raised owls on their territory and been strong advocates for the protection of habitat. So I need to say that in front of this video so you understand my language that I'm speaking when I say things like we or Canada or British Columbia or the Indigenous nations whose territory this is today. Spotted owl is what we call an old growth dependent species. It's a famous species because protecting spotted owl habitat means getting in the way of logging companies who want to log that habitat.
The spotted owl. As far as endangered species go, this is top of the list in Canada. Only found in South BC and only a couple of dozen left. This is the Siwash Creek area, east of the Fraser Canyon. It's 487 hectares of prime owl habitat and prime timber.
When I say spotted owl habitat, I'm talking about big old trees. Spotted owls are a predator, hunts at night, very powerful hearing, and will cruise through that forest, that old forest, which is more open underneath than the tree plantations. The forests that the companies and the government plant after logging is actually too dense for spotted owls and doesn't have enough old snags and things for spotted owls to nest in. So that's why spotted owls have been declining in numbers as more and more of their old growth forest is logged. When I started working on spotted owls back in the 1990s, in the early 90s, there were perhaps 50 pairs, 100 spotted owls.
And Canada in all this? It too has spotted owls, about 50 pairs in southwestern BC. They also are on the endangered species list, but in Canada, that's where it stops.
We have no legally enforceable law to protect their habitat. In other words, the citizens, unlike in the United States where they have a real law, the citizens can't say to the government, hey, you're driving this species into extinction.
In our forests, it's believed that at one time there would have been as many as 500 pairs of spotted owls within their range, which is an expanded lower mainland area. They only exist in Canada in the southwest mainland corner of the province where most of the people live too. So when I started, there were perhaps 100 spotted owl adults living in the local forests, and now today, the last known wild spotted owl, a female, was seen about 3 years ago and hasn't been seen since. Now, the province in 2007 started up a captive breeding program, and so now there's 30, 35 spotted owls in a captive breeding program, and they're producing chicks, and those chicks are there to be released into habitat. And so the big fight for the last 30 years is to get enough habitat. We've got some habitat, but not enough habitat to stop the decline, and more importantly, to believe that in the future, we're going to have enough habitat to restore the owls. Now, we passed a big milestone with the federal government, and that's what this video is all about. This milestone that we reached in June of this year. For 20 years, the federal government has been behind in releasing a fulsome, complete spotted owl recovery plan. A plan, first of all, says, is the spotted owl recoverable? Can it be saved from slipping away, from disappearing from Canada? And then, what's it going to take to bring the spotted owls back to healthy numbers? Well, that plan came out in June. We'd seen the draft plan for quite some time, but it was finalized in June of this year, 2025, and provided a full map of what the federal government calls critical habitat, the forests that need to be protected. The amount of those forests that need to be protected is about 4,000 square kilometers. The good news is half of those forests are already protected in our local local provincial parks, in Vancouver's water supply areas where there's no logging in those areas. There's lots of spotted owl habitat there. So about half the spotted owl critical habitat mapped by the feds is already protected, 2,000 square kilometers already protected. But the other 2,000 square kilometers has been open to logging. Provincial government has continued to issue logging permits in these critical forests. Even though they could see the draft plan now for years, they haven't stopped issuing logging permits. So the big question has been, once the federal government finalizes their spotted owl recovery plan, will BC honor it? Will they stop logging in the federally mapped critical habitat? So that's the period that we've been in. Now, the Wilderness Committee produced a newspaper, and that's what these updates are about. I promised people that I would from time to time bring you up to speed in what's happening in the fight to protect spotted owl habitat and to bring the species back from the brink of disappearing altogether from Canada. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through it step by step, some of the places, the absolutely beautiful places we visited this year and what we saw, both the good, the bad, and the ugly. To cut to the chase, what we found out is once June came by, the spotted owl recovery strategy was finalized, and BC is continuing to hand out logging permits in that spotted owl habitat. It means we've got a continued fight on our hands. Nobody wants to see any species disappear, but it's very, very simple. If BC continues to hand out logging permits in the federally mapped habitat, the spotted owl cannot persist. No species can persist without its critical habitat. That's why it's called critical habitat. That's why biologists map it. And so with the province still handing out logging permits in the federally mapped critical habitat, that's a big problem. So we have to rein the federal government in. They need to start enforcing their species at risk law, because they have a law. They have the power to protect this habitat. They need to get out and protect it. We're going to see what's gone on, and we're going to learn about the next steps we could take to get this logging of critical habitat stopped. So it was at Fire Lake that we learned the provincial government's true intentions. Because it really doesn't matter what they say, it matters what they do. Here's how it went down. We, at the Wilderness Committee, we put together a little crew, and we headed up to a place called Fire Lake. Fire Lake's located north of Harrison Lake. You have to go up a bunch of gravel forestry roads to get there. Went up to Fire Lake because we could see from the provincial government's maps that suddenly there were a string of proposed cut blocks, logging areas along Fire Lake. So here's the thing. This logging at Fire Lake was laid out by BC Timber Sales. And why that's important is BC Timber Sales is an arm of the provincial government. It's a government agency. Now, normally when a logging company is going to lay out cut blocks or propose cut blocks, they have quite a bit of leeway, private logging companies, right? They'll have an area they can log in, usually a large area, and they'll lay out their cut blocks. They don't have to log in spotted owl habitat, and a lot of companies don't log in spotted owl habitat. But BC Timber Sales is a government agency, and what they do is the government agency, BC Timber Sales, draws out the boundaries of the cut blocks. So it's the provincial government that is deciding where the cut blocks at Fire Lake go. And they drew them out in old growth forest, all of them, and they drew them out in critical habitat for the spotted owl. And that's what makes this particularly egregious. BC Timber Sales also often builds the access roads to the cut blocks. So this is the provincial government purposely targeting critical habitat of an endangered species. The endangered species. Hard to get much more endangered than the spotted owl. We went up there and had a look, and we were blown away. There has been some logging up near Fire Lake. This proposed logging, though, is right down like a necklace, a string, cut blocks in spotted owl critical habitat as mapped by the federal government. So we got down, we got the drone up, had a sort of a bird's eye view of the thing. Wow, what a forest. It's quite a mix of tree species. What really stood out was the amount of yellow cedar. That's important because yellow cedar are the most long-lived tree in Canada. There's a documented yellow cedar that had been logged on the Sunshine Coast that was 1,800 years old when it was cut, making it the oldest known tree in Canada. There's yellow cedar all up in those cut blocks that had been proposed to be logged in spotted owl critical habitat. So we documented that beautiful area. At both ends of Fire Lake are provincial recreation areas supposedly set aside, but on the one end of the lake, it's in a proposed cut block. So the public would look at a map and go, hey, this area is set aside for recreation, but no, cut block goes right over it. You know, that recreation area, when we look at the maps that show the tree species, wow, it really shows that Fire Lake is extremely diverse in forest types. There are areas of red cedar, yellow cedar, hemlock, but there are also quite large areas of old growth Douglas fir, which are getting super rare because the companies target them so hard. And a big piece of that old growth Douglas fir at Fire Lake is in the recreation area being targeted. It's just so sad to see BC Timber Sales proposing this terrible, terrible logging plan. We got together some information on tree ages, so generally the groves there, the forests that are being proposed to be logged are all old growth. Some are rated at well over 300 years old, those groves, and as I say, there'll be individual yellow cedar trees which will break 1,000 years in age. So this is a spectacular forest. Very rare to see such a forest survive to 2025. Our hope was that it wouldn't be approved because in June, the federal government finalized its spotted owl recovery plan. And there's Fire Lake in there as critical habitat in their finalized plan. And we hope that that would have caused the provincial government to honor the federal plan and to not approve the logging at Fire Lake. But it's September. Fire Lake became the first area that we were aware of that crossed the red line. The province actually approved the logging at Fire Lake in federally mapped spotted owl habitat. And so now we're in a whole new era where it's very clear the province has no intention at this point of honoring the Federal Species at Risk Act or the Federal Spotted Owl Recovery Plan. And so that's our update. And our action is I've put in the description of this video a link to our letter writing tool. It's like a page which allows you to write a letter to government officials. We send the letter on your behalf to a whole raft of government officials pushing one more time to get the logging of critical habitat stopped. It's so important for this species, the spotted owl. It's also important for all the other species that live in this region because there's a ton of them which are old growth dependent, and the spotted owl is just the first to get in such a dire condition, right? Perhaps one wild-born spotted owl left. We're now relying on the captive breeding program to release owls into the habitat. And then in order to get back to 250 owls, which is a healthy number on the habitat, we need that habitat connected and not fragmented. And this logging at Fire Lake, it's so sad because of the spectacular nature of the old growth forest, but it's also sad because it's crossing the red line. The province is showing they're not stopping even though the Spotted Owl Recovery Plan has been finalized. That requires a response. Now, thousands of us have written in, and I'm so appreciative of that. That's the hope of holding on to endangered species. Please write your letter today. Just look in the description of this video, go to the link, write the letter. I promise to keep doing these update videos so that you can follow along this story, this desperate fight to hold on to this wonderful endangered species in our neck of the woods. We're trying to save a lot of things, including our own honor. How embarrassing, how sad to live in a jurisdiction that runs species into extinction when clearly everyone involved knows what we need to do is be protecting the critical habitat. So let's hang in there. It's such a beautiful place in the world that we live, and traveling out to these old growth spotted owl habitat areas has just convinced me we live in the most beautiful place in the planet, and we have a responsibility to pass it on. So thank you for helping us do that. I'll see you in the next video. This has been Joe Foy for the Wilderness Committee. Bye for now.